What is going on, everyone? So in this week's video, I want to talk about my process of metering for transparency film for landscape photography. This is something I get questions about quite frequently, and I've done some videos about it in the past, but I've changed my process a little bit since then, so I figure I should probably refresh it with some more examples and some of the other techniques that I use. So for starters, I use a Sekonic 758 spot meter. You will also see me use this. This is a gray card from Manfrotto. It pops up like that, so very handy to carry in the field. There's two techniques I use. The first is averaging, which I've used for quite a while. It's very well suited for working, especially with transparency film. And the other is by using the gray card and metering off that. And there are some situations where that just makes life a lot easier. So before we get to the discussion of how I meter, let's talk very briefly about dynamic range. So there are some scenes that have a very wide dynamic range where you have the highlights very bright, the shadows very dark. Some scenes have less of a dynamic range. It's important to note that transparency film has a very narrow dynamic range. So if you try to use transparency film for photographing a scene that has a very wide dynamic range, it gets to be a little bit problematic. You can shift your exposure so that the highlights are fine, but your shadows are going to be all blocked up and dark. Or you can shift your exposure to be for the shadows are fine, but the highlights are blown out. And sometimes even if you're right in the middle, your highlights are too bright, your shadows are dark. So it's really important to photograph subjects that are very well suited for the film. You'll frequently see me working in subdued light. And one of the reasons is that this is a range of tones which is very well suited for transparency film, because if you have a limited range of tones for the scene and then your film matches that, that is very ideal. So let's talk about averaging first. So this is a technique I've used for quite a while, and this right here is a very good example of it. This particular glow in Death Valley, you have this wall that catches some really bright light right there, yet you also have this really dark wall. And I was unsure if I would be able to photograph this with transparency film because of how bright that is and how dark that is. But I was able to thread the needle with a perfect exposure to make sure that I'm not losing detail here or there. And the way I did that is by averaging, where I took my spot meter and I went ahead and I metered the brightest area right there. So I looked through the spot meter, I hit the meter button, it gave me a reading, and then I hit the memory button right there on the front. Then I pointed at the dark tones over here. Same thing, I looked through my spot meter, metered that, then hit the memory button right there. So now I have two settings logged into the memory. With those two in the memory, then I hit the average button. Now the average button is going to split the difference and give you the exposure that is right in the middle. And in this particular scene, I can then hit the, with the average set in place, I can then hit the meter button and then look at the particular tones in there. It'll tell me exactly how bright that is in relation to my meter setting, how dark this is. And with transparency film, there are some numbers you got to be aware of. Anything that shows -2 or lower, so -3, -4, anything in that range, anything darker than -2, you're really not going to have any detail in the shadows. When I looked through the meter, this showed -1.8, so I'm right in the threshold, but I knew I was going to have detail. Likewise, over here, this bright area showed about +1.8. So again, I'm under the threshold because anything brighter than +2 is probably going to be blown out. So this particular scene right here, if you have this much dynamic range in the scene, my film is basically a perfect match for it. If it had been any brighter here or darker there, I really wouldn't have been able to capture the full range of tones. And in this case, I was threading the needle with that exposure. Another example here. So this scene has less dynamic range. It still has a pretty good, I mean, this is in subdued light, but you still have some pretty dark tones and you have some pretty bright tones. So I use the same technique for this. I found the darkest scene I want to hold detail, which is going to be up in the sort of the crown of the tree up there, the dark parts of the trunk. So I metered that. So I metered it through the spot meter, and I hit the memory button to log that into memory. Then I looked for the brightest areas, which was maybe up in here. And sometimes it's something out of view, not even in the composition, but representative of the same light. So I metered off the brighter area, hit my meter button, then hit the memory button. And at that point, I hit the average button on my light meter. Then I look through the light meter and I evaluate all the tones of the scene, look at the bright areas, dark areas in between, all the while holding the metering button here. And in the process of doing so, you're going to see those numbers. And if everything's kind of fitting within that between +2 and -2, you know that you're going to hold detail for that particular subject. So this gives peace of mind in that scene. And so in that particular situation, I had a good meter because I had a good meter reading because I had good samples to draw off in terms of bright and dark tone. Here's another good example. This is also one where I did a average meter reading. I looked at some of the dark tone back in here, those dark leaves back in there. So I metered that, logged it into memory. My highlight was taken from probably that rock right there. So I metered that, log that in memory, hit the average button, and then you look through the scene. Now there might be some areas that are going to be like way back in those deep recesses. Maybe it's like -3.5, but it doesn't matter because standing there to my eye, that area was basically black anyways. I'm more concerned with that area and that area there. So that worked out very well. Now there are some scenes, like this one right here. This scene has a rather limited range of tones. There's not a lot of good dark tone to work off of. There's a lot of mid-tone. And so trying to find a dark area to meter and a bright area to meter gets a little bit tricky for a scene like this. So that is where the gray card comes in handy. So you'll see me using this a lot for scenes I'm photographing on the ground because oftentimes they're already in rather subdued light. For this, all you do is hold this in the same light that your subject is in, sometimes at a little bit of an angle, about a 45-degree angle kind of towards the light. Take a single meter reading off of it. You're going to go ahead and log that into memory, hit the average button, and then look through the scene, look how bright and dark everything is. Make sure that those numbers make sense, and that's generally going to give a pretty good exposure. Now that particular scene had a very narrow range, so you don't have any really dark tones, you don't have any really bright tones. It's a narrower range. My film actually has a fair amount more dynamic range in that scene. So you can actually adjust your exposure a little brighter or a little darker to taste, depending on how you want it to turn out. I generally want things to be a little bit on the brighter side, just to make sure that I have plenty of detail in those shadow areas. And we got this scene. This can be a tricky scene to meter for because we do have a larger dynamic range. Look at the brightness of those clouds. We have the darker foreground. We have the light on the mountains there. This is a scene where the dynamic range is beyond what ProVia can handle. So this is one where a graduated neutral density filter is going to be necessary. I knew in advance that I would be using a 2-stop graduated ND filter just to cover up those bright areas there. I know from experience that the difference between foreground shade and a background in sun is going to be 2 stops. And so I use that filter, and to meter the scene, I'm going to ignore the top. I'm only going to look here at the foreground. But also this foreground, there's a lot of mid-tone. There's a lot of mid-tone where I don't really have a good representation for a bright area. I don't have a good representation for a dark area. And simply just metering off something, it may not necessarily be something that is neutral gray. So this is where the gray card also comes in handy. So in this scene, I'll either just put the gray card on the ground, or sometimes I hold it at about a 45-degree angle, just get a little bit of light on it. But I can go ahead and meter off this, set that into be a memory, put my meter in the average mode, and then look through the scene, check out the tones in the foreground, make sure everything is well within that range. Everything should be kind of in about the middle. But then I can start pointing the meter at the sky area, and knowing that I'm going to have a 2-stop ND filter, if this cloud here says +4, what it really means is it's about +2. So I'm going to hold detail in some of those bright areas, because you have to do the mental math on that. But having this pop-up gray card gives a lot of peace of mind if you're in a scene that is changing rapidly, or if you are photographing something on the ground where you don't have a good representative dark and light tone. And by comparison, if you have a scene like this right here, a gray card may not work well for this because we want to map the tones of this scene right to the film. I'm not concerned about what a true gray card exposure is going to be for this scene, because sometimes it's off by a fair amount. I just want to make sure that I can see the dark tones and I can see the bright tones and that everything matches up. And another question I get sometimes is, why not simply use an incident meter reading as opposed to spot metering off a gray card, or by doing an average of the bright and dark scenes and all the stuff along those lines. But here's the thing, if you use an incident light meter, it gives you a very handy setting right there, but you have no way of verifying how bright or how dark each subject is. It should be very similar to spot metering off a gray card. But with the spot metering off the gray card, setting that as an average, I can then look through that spot meter, see how specifically bright or dark a subject is, and it gives me a feeling for if that's a good exposure or not. Because we don't necessarily always want to go with exactly what the meter says. Sometimes we might want to go a little brighter, maybe a little darker, just based on experience. And by using a spot meter, it gives us the ability to do that. So that is why I don't use the instant meter reading, because it leaves it up to a little bit of chance. But there's a wide variety of meters out there. There's lots of different techniques out there depending on the film, depending on the meter. So just because I use this meter, just because I use this technique, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be ideal for what you're doing, but it's just another method that's out there, and it has worked very, very well for me through the years. But I want to thank everyone for watching, and we'll see you around next time.